I am delighted to be introducing Chris Armstrong, whom I've known for many years now. He is our featured webinar speaker today. He is the president of Armstrong Process Group. Chris is an internationally recognized thought leader in enterprise architecture, process improvement, systems engineering, formal modeling, and agile iterative methods. So this is our first series. Chris will be doing 9 more with us. He also represents APG at the Open Group, the Object Management Group, and the Eclipse Foundation. He is into systems engineering, formal modeling, as I've said before, and he is a dynamic and engaging speaker. Chris, over to you.
Good morning or afternoon or evening. Let's see, so talking about enterprise architecture value chain today. And as Birgit very nicely described kind of where I'm coming from and what APG is about, ultimately, you know, we're a community of practicing architects, you know, trying to bring proven practical processes based on our experience with end users and our participation in industry standards organizations. In addition to our participation in groups like the OMG Open Group and the Eclipse Process Framework, we're also partners with a couple of tool vendors to try to, again, help make this stuff real for end users, namely Spark Systems, HP, and IBM. So, you know, let's just take a step back and think about the context here of, you know, what the whole point of what we're really trying to get to, which is, you know, we're looking at, you know, trying to implement an enterprise architecture capability at a particular end user organization. Of course, there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of things that we need to think about putting in place to make that an appropriate, relevant, practical practice that's going to deliver some value. So within your organizations, your leadership is likely, wondering, you know, what's the best way to try to distill what the value proposition of enterprise architecture is to the enterprise, and in particular, of course, to the key business stakeholders. But one of the challenges is that most stakeholders really are only concerned about the outcomes of enterprise architecture, but not the details of the implementation of that, which of course is of great interest to us as practitioners. But, you know, being that as it may, you know, the leadership team needs to have some approach or framework for helping understand, you know, what things are need to be able to implement and bring to the forefront in order to deliver whatever that value proposition is. One of the things that's really important with enterprise architecture is we want to make sure that it's well connected with the dynamic aspects of our enterprise. So it's really important that we have a good idea about how enterprise architecture supports and integrates with other value chains. And of course, that's one of the rationale for why we positioned the notion that we should really think about what is the value chain for enterprise architecture. So, for example, in a insurance company, for example, there might be a value chain that might be described as a shop, buy, service, or claim. In the IT space, particularly based on best practices described by COVID, many organizations are using a plan, build, run value chain to describe the business of IT. And the whole idea that what we found, and I'm going to guess many of you have found, is, you know, improving the architecture capability is pretty darn challenging if there's no compelling call to action. And, you know, in order for enterprise architecture to really deliver upon its promise to the enterprise, it really requires that cross-organization executive support. And at the end of the day, you know, our experience has been pretty clear that, you know, nobody really cares about this unless they really understand what's in it for me. So, you know, we're really trying to make sure that we are, you know, propping up enterprise architecture so that it doesn't degenerate into what, unfortunately, a lot of organizations have found in the past, an ivory tower, you know, a community of really smart people that do something that the business really doesn't understand. We really don't want to get rid of them because they sure seem to know what they're talking about, but sometimes we really struggle with exactly what value do they add and what do they do. And so we want to make sure that we've got that integration of enterprise architecture into the rest of the enterprise. So, kind of just starting off right away, let's just introduce what we're proposing could be the architecture value chain. And you can see that here at the top of this slide. The idea that, ultimately what we're trying to do with enterprise architecture is we're trying to understand the position that we're in, where are we, and where do we want to go. Then we need to perform a set of analysis activities to really get to looking at that content that we've harvested and synthesized to try to then lead us to making some decisions and then ultimately responding. And as many of you may know, the whole idea behind a value chain, which was made very popular back in the 80s by Michael Porter in his seminal book, is the idea that at each stage in the value chain, additional value is added, whereby at the end of the value chain, enough value has been accumulated to basically make a profit or do something of benefit to the organization. And, one of the things that I've seen taking a look particularly, at enterprise architecture, really trying to represent these four fundamental sets of activities, is that, we spent a lot of time doing things really in the beginning part of the value chain, and we'll get into some more of the details of the underlying capability model that could support this in just a little bit, around, trying to do modeling to understand the current state and describe the target state, understand stakeholder requirements, do some, trade-off analysis and affinity analysis and other things. But, those are all means to another end, which is we, ultimately have to put together some sort of plan to execute to respond to the things that are going on in our environment. And ultimately, if we don't get to that last step of the value chain, right, my experience says it really puts into question just what was the whole point of doing the first two things. So really want to make sure that we understand we really need to go through all of those four high-level steps to deliver upon the promise of enterprise architecture. And, what this slide is really trying to get to is trying to contextualize the kinds of initiatives or programs that might be in flight or being considered to be launched within an organization, and how those map to different parts of the architecture value chain. But the other notion of the other dimension of this slide is trying to show how that may intersect with the value chain of the IT business, i.e. Plan, build, and run. So again, this is just an example that we put together based on some work that we're doing with a particular client. But really, again, trying to make sure we understand that, for example, at the enterprise level, there may be some initiatives that have to do with, for example, simplifying the IT and technology environment. And so that's represented here as being a two-phased approach, that the first chunk of trying to get our arms around what does it mean to simplify our enterprise, Simplification version 1.0, is really going to focus on the understand and analyze part of the value chain, where Simplification version 2.0, the second part of that initiative, is really going to focus on, okay, well, what are we going to do about that, and how are we going to actually change the organization through architecture engagement? There might be other types of enterprise/planning level activities, such as being able to do benchmarking or be able to support business units in doing their annual planning exercises. But then we also, find that architecture may apply certainly to the program level, where we're trying to figure out how can we, uplift the ability to do more effective program planning by exploiting architecture practices and capabilities, as well as the delivery of those programs. Of course, then we can go down to the project level, where we could take a look at potentially looking at how can enterprise architecture contribute to accelerating and making more effective project impact assessment. This is one of the value propositions that we've seen a lot of organizations gravitate towards, namely, without enterprise architecture, particularly for large-scale risky initiatives, many organizations find that they, send many, troops of people off to an off-site where they talk about, where they are, where they want to go, what are all the different moving pieces within the enterprise. And some of those, activities can take many, many, many days and consume, hundreds, if not thousands of hours. And if we perhaps can exploit the understand and analyze part of the architecture value chain, perhaps we could reduce the investment for doing project impact assessment from being a several day or several week or even possibly a several month activity to be possibly done in a couple of days or even a couple of hours. But then we also want to make sure that we don't lose sight that architecture has some contributions that it can make to business and IT operations, really kind of in the run space of the IT value chain. So, for example, as it relates to trying to support business continuity and disaster recovery planning, how we can use enterprise architecture to, keep our technology footprint relevant and refreshed through technology lifecycle management, or how do we make sure that we're making the appropriate investment decisions as it relates to information risk management. So the whole idea is that, if you were to, try to apply this approach, you would, take the two different value chains and the 12 quadrants here, and then overlay them with the things that are occurring in your business today, or perhaps are going to be launched, immediately after the calendar year, to help again contextualize. This is why we need architecture, because there are these initiatives that are going on within this enterprise, and we feel that enterprise architecture can make a significant contribution towards the success of those initiatives. So just a little bit about, some nomenclature. One of the things that we've seen is, and I think this is getting better in the past number of, years, but there's still a little bit of ambiguity and lack of clarity about just, what the heck is a capability. And here we see a couple of definitions from some standards organizations. So, TOGAF, which I'm guessing a number of people here are likely familiar with, defines a capability as a business-focused outcome that is delivered by the completion of one or more work packages. And to be quite honest, that definition of a capability has always left me a little deflated. That definition is really focusing on how we use capabilities in Phase E of the TOGAF ADM, opportunities and solutions, which is certainly not an inappropriate or irrelevant thing, but as many of you may know, capabilities are actually much more pervasive in TOGAF ADM than might be betrayed by this particular definition. So we could take a look at a different standard for a definition. We take a look at DODAF, the Department of Defense Architecture Framework. And in that approach, the definition of a capability is the ability to achieve a desired effect under a specified set of standards and conditions by the combination of ways and means, such as activities and resources, to perform a set of activities. So for those of you that may or may not be familiar with DODAF, uses a little bit more esoteric meta model language, but I think is a pretty decent definition, although not necessarily one I'd probably share with a non-architect. BizBach from the Business Architecture Guild talks about a capability being a particular ability or capacity that a business may possess or exchange to achieve a specific purpose or outcome. And one of the, just to try to, again, more contextualize what a capability is and how it relates to the other things that we may want to manage within our architecture space. Here's again a picture of the DM2 meta model out of DODAF, and it's the reason I like to show this is that it really makes it real clear, at least from a DODAF perspective, that a capability is a really important thing. It's one of the 4 or 5 first-class elements that really provides the context for the rest of the architectural activities. And here we see on slide 7 an example of how we've kind of tailored what a capability is based on the TOGAF 9 architecture content meta model. So some of you may find this picture familiar, at least in some of the words. One thing to call out here is that we've kind of, done some color coding here to represent some of the different domains. So the orange elements on the left represent what we consider to be the strategic business architecture, which is really why are we here and what are we supposed to do to serve our constituents. where the yellow represents the operational business architecture, which is what are the things that we actually do in this enterprise, who does them, how do we do that, where are they performed. And then all of the green elements represent the IT architecture in TOGAF. That, of course, would be the application, data, and technology architecture. So in the TOGAF 9 meta model, the whole idea of a capability, again, is really kind of, if we were to take a look at that meta model, it kind of hangs this concept called a work package in the upper right-hand corner of the meta model diagram. And that really doesn't represent what we've found to be the real strategic focal point of what a capability is really supposed to be. And ultimately, the thing that we've seen around what a capability is really trying to do is provide a simplified lens for looking at the enterprise landscape to roll up different kinds of content to help high-level stakeholders, particularly, that don't have the time and possibly the interest of getting down into the gory implementation details, to really make informed business decisions without necessarily having to get down into the weeds. So here, we're showing a capability is something that is traced from the business strategy out of objectives and measures that are then subsequently related to things like goals and strategy. So again, this is really trying to get to the whole idea that a capability is supposed to be delivering something. We should be able to measure that, and as we choose to invest in uplifting our capabilities, we're expecting certain kinds of outcomes. But then we do need to, trace that to the things in our enterprise that are actually supporting and executing that capability. So in this particular client's situation, we decided that we were going to have capability really be a lens into the operational business architecture, particularly, namely, the functions that are performed by certain parts of the organization, and then the services that are made available to operationalize that capability. And just FYI, we had a little bit of ambiguity and lack of clarity on this in earlier versions of this meta model, where we actually talked about, a capability really being an aggregation of any kind of element within the operational business architecture or IT architecture. Namely, a capability could be related not just perhaps to a function or a service, but also a process, an IS service, an application component, a technology component. But what we found is that that was really confusing to people, and we really wanted to provide a lot more clear guidance that we really wanted capabilities to be the entry point into the operational business architecture, and then traceability relationships that those business architecture elements have with the rest of the IT architecture would be kind of the indirect way we would get to some of those finer grained elements. So, what we did is we took, some of the industry standard definitions and kind of came up with a tailored definition of what a capability is, namely an ability that an organization, person, or system possesses, with the idea that a capability describes what a company needs to be able to do to execute its strategy, as opposed to how you do it. So again, that's, was reflected in the previous meta model. By having the capability being a part of the strategic business architecture and providing, again, that view into the operations of the enterprise as it relates to how you support that capability. We typically find that capabilities are expressed in general high-level terms. Again, the common thing that we often hear people say about a capability is that it's an aggregation of people, process, and tools. And we typically want to represent a set of capabilities in some sort of catalog and describe that catalog in such a way that's indifferent to the ways that those capabilities are governed and or made operational. So, what is this thing about a capability model? Well, our experience is this is just another one of the kinds of reference models that we might want to create and manage as a part of our enterprise architecture practice. So, of course, there's a lot of different kinds of reference models. A lot of organizations invest in technology reference models to help get their arms around, the technology platforms and what are their preferred technologies and aging technologies that they're trying to deprecate. So we really want to think of a capability model as the same kind of thing, but it's, again, at the strategic business architecture level. And as it relates to enterprise architecture, really you want to think of the capability model should represent the things that people that are performing architecture are the things that they should be doing or could be doing in the real world. And that's, I know, a key point about what a capability is trying to represent, is it may not always represent things that you actually do now, but from an industry standard perspective, represents the collective understanding of these are things that we should do in order for us to deliver upon our expected outcomes. A little bit of guidance on, some nomenclature. We typically think of capabilities as things. They should have noun-like names, and we'll see some example of those in a little bit for the architecture value chain and capability model. But one of the things that we find very prevalent as well is that that reference model of a capability model is used as a framework for a service portfolio. And so we often think of injecting very explicit services as the lowest level off of the capability leaf nodes. And those services tend to have active verb noun-like names, with the whole idea, again, that services can be composed and configured into higher level services. And one of the common practices, although I don't know that this is necessarily universal, but it's certainly prevalent, that we contextualize the top level portions of a capability model with a value chain. So just exactly what, is a capability model good for in an enterprise architecture practice? Well, ultimately, it helps us to put together roadmaps for evolving the enterprise architecture practice. And as many of you know, if you've been exposed to content in TOGAF, there's all sorts of good stuff in the 700-plus pages of that standard. But what's not real clear to the uninformed is, gee, if I am just starting off doing enterprise architecture in my organization and, we don't even know how to spell enterprise architecture, is there a subset of those 700 pages that are pertinent for my level of maturity and the things I'm trying to achieve? And right now, at least out of the box, there isn't that particular kind of guidance that we're providing from the Open Group. And so, of course, this is something that we're hoping to make some progress on in the future. Namely, TOGAF really describes itself, in my opinion, as if you are mature enough to perform all of it as it's described, and particularly what I would call a level 3 organization, which is a pretty mature organization. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those different maturity levels in just a second. So the whole idea that, wouldn't it be cool if we could have a capability model for enterprise architecture based on a value chain that had associated with it a set of conformance requirements that described what kinds of behaviors would you expect to see in an organization at different levels of maturity as it relates to each of the individual capabilities that are supporting that value chain. One of the other things that we're seeing is being very popular and prevalent is, creating service portfolios. Of course, this is all the rage in IT service management, to create that IT service portfolio. So, hey, why don't we take a hint from that and think about, what are some of the services that we're providing as enterprise architects, and perhaps we can gain some wisdom from trying to package that into some sort of enterprise architecture service portfolio. Plus, we can also use a capability model as a reference model for doing mappings to different standards and tools. So one of the things we'll take a look at a little bit later is, based on this value chain and capability model, how well does the current version of TOGAF cover those requisite topics, and are there gaps and opportunities for improvement? How do the capabilities map to the conformance requirements of the OpenCA practice experience-based certification from the Open Group? Other architecture standards such as ISO 15704, 288, and 4210. And another thing that's perhaps a little more practical for end users is how does this relate to the kinds of requirements that we expect our enterprise architecture tools to deliver, both from an end user perspective, from kind of an RFP, a solicitation of bringing some of those tools inside, as well as having a map that shows how different vendors' implementations address different parts of the capability model and the value chain. So if you give me just a second, I know I had wanted to have the moderator send out a couple of poll questions just to kind of get a pulse of how this content is pertinent to what's going on in your organization. So give me just one second. All right, very good. So here we see on slide 11, the EA value chain with a slight little variation that I'll explain a little bit, as well as the supporting underlying top-level capabilities. So as we saw a couple slides ago, we think of the architecture value chain as really being a four-step high-level process. We're trying to understand things, then base that understanding as the foundation for providing some analysis. Then based on that analysis, we make some decisions, and then based on those decisions, we actually then prepare a response to execute and deliver. A couple of our clients have found that they want to simplify that value chain even a little bit further and aggregate the analyze and decide portions of the value chain into a single thread called strategize. So it's understand, strategize, respond. But either way, we still kind of have these four chunks of underlying capabilities. So if we take a quick look at the understand part of the value chain, this is where we would consider you would do things that we call domain modeling. So this is basically describing different architecture domains like business architecture or data architecture or technology architecture, but also trying to understand, how, why people are, caring about enterprise architecture. So trying to do some requirement solicitation with our architecture stakeholders, analyzing the different positions those stakeholders are taking, doing some scoping of the architecture project that we're about to begin, as well as putting together some vision of a future state and why we're doing this through some envisioning activities. Then in the analyze part of the value chain, we're thinking about doing some architectural analysis, and this might include things like gap analysis, which of course is represented as a first-class activity in the TOGAF ADM. Impact analysis, and this is, represented in one of the steps of phases B, C, and D, where we're trying to resolve impacts across the architectural landscape. We're supposed to be performing a trade-off analysis as a part of some of those activities, and this is, to me, a really big part of what represents a key thing that architects do that's a rigorous part of their profession that perhaps is not as much for others, of really trying to provide some trade-off analysis, namely, well, we could do it like this, and that might work well, but it will have this side effect, or we could do it like that, and that might deliver a better outcome for this, but it's going to have this side effect. So providing that ability to do trade-offs, as well as affinity analysis, which is, just a technical term for, looking at a bunch of things and grouping them together in a way that they represent shared common characteristics. We also want to introduce architecture reporting and different forms of reporting as a way of also supporting that analysis activities. And then once we, again, have that position of kind of knowing where we are and different ways of looking at it, now we actually need to make some decisions. And so this is where we would introduce the architecture road mapping activities, which again are often going to be domain specific. So again, capability road mapping, service road mapping, application road mapping, as well as architectural planning. So things like architecture decision making, migration planning, or architecture risk assessments. And then, of course, the whole idea with this value chain is that, doing understand activities, analyze activities, and decide activities are, again, all means to the ultimate end, which is respond. And this is what, quite honestly, what I see a lot of organizations really struggle with in really trying to operationalize. And again, that's the whole reason that we're doing all this stuff. So, as a profession, I think we've spent, quite a bunch of time trying to figure out the first parts of this value chain, and certainly don't want to suggest there aren't opportunities for improvement, but we really need to kind of get past the notion that architects are focusing and capturing all this content and perhaps using rigorous modeling tools to help with that, doing this analysis, all that sort of stuff. But, if that's where you stop in enterprise architecture, that's what I would consider to be the ivory tower of enterprise architecture. So again, we think about lots of stuff and we look at it a lot of different ways, but then, and we may make some decisions about it, but perhaps because of authority or lack of jurisdiction, nobody really cares what we think, and they just go along their own merry way, doing things the way they've always done. So the respond part of the value chain is really where the greatest value of architecture is contributed. And then, of course, that's where we need to think about how are we going to do architectural lifecycle management and things in the different architecture domains, as well as architecture governance, such as risk management, compliance management, and asset management. And as you wouldn't be surprised with the other capability models that you may or may not have seen, these first-class capabilities that support the 4 steps of the value chain sit on top of a platform of supporting capabilities that we've identified of being, 5 different chunks: architecture knowledge management, architecture operations, delivery, integration, and human capital management. And it's worthwhile, again, calling out that this is actually, the preliminary outcomes of a working group at the Open Group. So this is really a call to action for people that might be interested in coming to San Diego, for example, in the beginning of February, called the Enterprise Architecture Capability Improvement Project. And so this is outside of the Architecture Forum specifically. Because it affects more than just TOGAF, but it may affect other forums within the Open Group. So as we continue to evolve this, I'm very much interested in having people come in and contribute, because as many of you may know, a lot of stuff doesn't go as quickly as we might like at some of these standards organizations, and one of that is because it's a volunteer effort, and we need as many volunteers as we can possibly get. So again, if people are interested in making some of those contributions, please don't hesitate to let me know about that. So if we move on a little bit further, here we can see more of a detailed bill of materials of the supporting capabilities, and I'm not going to read all these. I'm just going to call out a couple different ones of them. But the one thing that I know I always take away from looking at this is that it's really a very powerful affirmation that enterprise architecture, the things you need to do to make it work, there's a lot of moving parts. It's pretty complicated. And again, to effectively apply enterprise architecture based on what your requirements are, may not require you to, make investments in all these capabilities, but that'll be something that we'll talk about in just a little bit about how can you make some informed decisions about some of this stuff. So when we're talking about architecture knowledge management, we're thinking about, basic modeling capabilities. How do we do current state modeling versus future state modeling? FYI, that's something that I find that many architecture tools, particularly future state modeling, make very difficult to do. So there's definitely an opportunity with the state of industry to make future state modeling and gap analysis be much more effective. The whole idea of creating different kinds of reference models, the need to manage architecture requirements, as well as creating different kinds of reference architectures. When it comes to operating the architecture capability, we certainly have things that have to do with architecture governance, how we manage architecture change through different kinds of monitoring activities. How do we establish a clear vision for architecture through leadership activities? And of course, not surprisingly, at least from an APG perspective, being partners with a number of tool vendors, we take a very much a tool agnostic approach, but we have certainly discovered that without some sort of tooling beyond Microsoft Office, it is very, very difficult to sustain the architecture value chain without some more rigorous tools. Then we need to get into thinking about how do we actually deliver architecture services. So there's the whole idea that there's some professional services that we can contribute, the ways that we can support projects, the methods that we're using to perform architecture activities, and some of our architecture best practices. One of the big things that we see as a huge opportunity for a lot of organizations is architecture integration. This kind of gets a little bit back to also the ivory tower syndrome that a lot of organizations struggle with. And not to oversimplify it, but you know, one of the reasons people don't get a lot of the benefit out of it is that enterprise architecture is an island unto itself, and so we really need to think about how are we going to integrate enterprise architecture with other professions and capabilities within the organization, like IT service management or solution delivery or application management, project management, procurement. And again, you know, all of these, you know, bulleted lists here are not necessarily finite, but at least an initial set to start from. So there's certainly a lot of other places that we may want to think about doing integration. And a couple of times where we've done some surveys and assessments, we've identified up to 25 or 30 different areas within an enterprise that are kind of doing similar things or could really exploit enterprise architecture's investments, but they don't know about it because they're not connected. Then there's the whole idea of being able to integrate our architectural content across the enterprise. So a lot of people have architecture repositories, but again, if all they do is sit by themselves and don't exchange and integrate with other portfolios of data, you may find yourself struggling with that. And then, of course, we need to be able to make sure we understand how we're going to manage the change of the organization as we continue to uplift and touch more parts of the enterprise. And then we've got the human capital management portions of enterprise architecture. You know, how do we get new architects on board, get them trained, get them tools, get them oriented? How do we continue to develop and uplift their skills? And then how do we, you know, what investments do we make internally at our organization around the architecture profession? So trying to give you a little closer example of, you know, what an actual capability might look like if we got down to the gory details of specifying it. So here we're going to take one of the capabilities out of the capability model, business architecture modeling. Its parent capability is architecture modeling, and it's a part of the understand part of the value chain. And then here's, again, just a small glimpse of the kinds of services that we might categorize under the business architecture modeling capability. So the services that enterprise architecture provides is the ability to create a business capability model, create an organizational structural model, create some process models and function models, and maybe establish traceability amongst those different elements. So that's, again, kind of the service portfolio side. Then the idea that there are, again, people, processes, and tools. So we're going to be using the business architecture modeling process version 1.2. So perhaps that's a prescriptive extension of some of the things that TOGAF describes, or maybe a homegrown method that we created. But again, something that really specifically tells people how to perform business architecture modeling. Who are the people that are involved? And what we've chosen to do here is represent that as a set of roles that are related to kind of a RACI matrix of, you know, who's responsible, who approves, consults, and informs. So in this case, you know, the role responsible for business architecture modeling, no surprising, is business architect. People that approve it might be a capability manager or a process owner. We consult with subject matter experts, and we want to keep the business unit vice president in the loop. What tools are we going to use? Here we have an example of, you know, using Spark's Enterprise Architect, but of course there's many other tools out there that could do that as well. And then what are some of the KPIs that we're going to use to demonstrate that this capability is occurring and perhaps improving? Number of models created, and, you know, which is really more of a measure of, are people doing modeling? But that's not necessarily a good measure of, is it making a difference? So that's really kind of the idea behind the second KPI. You know, how many of the models that we've created were actually used for performing impact analysis? And as I'm sure you wouldn't be surprised, you know, none of these capabilities stand alone. There's often related capabilities. So, you know, doing business architecture modeling, which is a part of, you know, the first class value chain in Understand, requires supporting capabilities such as current state modeling, meta model management, viewpoint management, modeling tools, reporting, modeling skills. Now, that's something, you know, we don't want to lose sight of, is that there's a non-trivial transformation in people's heads that they need to go through if they're being used to using office productivity tools like Visio, moving to a full-fledged modeling tool, and then, of course, training to help them use that tool in the appropriate way. So here we see an example of a capability heat map, again, aligned with the value chain. And, just FYI, this represents Chris Armstrong's opinion, so it's by no means a official reflection by the Open Group. But, as I take a look at the 700-plus pages of the standard, think about how helpful and useful that is to end users in uplifting those capabilities. We basically have the 8 top-level chunks of the capability model here. So I think TOGAF does a pretty good job of describing and identifying the need for domain modeling and requirement solicitation. In particular, domain modeling is really what phases B, C, and D are about. And requirement solicitation is a big part of the focus of phase A, and of course it falls through into the subsequent phases as well. I think TOGAF does okay with architectural analysis, but I think there definitely could be some improvements. Architecture reporting really isn't talked about a lot, but there's a couple of things in there that provide a foundation. TOGAF does talk about road mapping, but I think there's an opportunity for improving the guidance on how to do roadmaps. I think there's some conflicting terminology that's being used. But again, it does, I think, a pretty good job of recognizing that we need to do planning and provide some good guidance on that. I think it does a pretty good job around architecture governance, but one of the big things that I think is really an oversight in TOGAF is lifecycle management. So, for example, we're doing an engagement right now where we're helping a Fortune 100 company put together a future state technology lifecycle management process. And one of the things that they were interested in is, can you please help us understand how our current practices relate to what TOGAF describes? And we were kind of like, TOGAF really doesn't describe that very much. So there isn't a lot of stuff to compare it to. So I think there's a huge opportunity for uplifting TOGAF in a future version to make it a little bit more clear how can we use TOGAF to do things like technology lifecycle management. Again, there's hints of it in there, but nothing real explicit. And then when it comes to some of the supporting capabilities, TOGAF does okay in knowledge management and operations. I think does a pretty good job in delivery. To me, ultimately, that's about what the ADM is about. Touches on some of the architecture integration topics, but certainly could go a little bit further, and again, not too shabby on the human capital management side. But then when the other whole idea behind a capability model is to use it as the basis or framework for performing a maturity assessment. And so here we see a maturity model that we align with that's very applicable in a lot of different domains. This is the business process maturity model, the BPMM, from the OMG. And of course, this is not to be confused with the BPMN, the business process modeling notation, which is from the same team. And this is a pretty in-depth specification that describes the kinds of key process areas and institutional goals. It's very much similar to the capability maturity model from the SEI. But it talks about, the maturity of your organization to fulfill its business processes. Level 1 being initial firefighting. Level 2 being managed. We've got the ability to get some predictable, reliable results in different business units or departments across the organization. But then finally, we're trying to get to level 3, which is, and this is pretty common in most capability frameworks, the idea that we have a standard process that is executed across the enterprise. And of course, then that provides the foundation for being able to get more predictable about where we're making improvements and the expected outcomes, and then eventually get into a continuous process improvement through an innovating organization. So we can use that capability model as an example of describing, well, what might be some of the conformance requirements related to those 5 different levels of maturity for a very specific capability. And this is likely to be a topic in an upcoming webinar. So here the capability is architecture decision-making. It is a part of the architecture planning capability in the strategize step or the decide step. What's the driver? So this is the contextualization of, well, why do we think we care about this now? Well, because we have some simplification initiatives going on, and we're trying to uplift our technology lifecycle management. And so here we see, you know, if you're a level 1 organization, as it relates to decision making, you'll likely find that architecture decisions are made implicitly by the team. They're not documented. There really aren't criteria to help inform you what is a architecturally significant decision, and there's really nobody that's been tagged to be responsible for that. Level 2, managed, is, you know, we at least are making some progress that we're assigning that responsibility to the project architect. Architecture decisions are made explicitly by the project architect, and however, they're informally documented in various deliverables. Then we get to level 3, that we actually have clear criteria for determining what is architecturally significant mean, so that the architect has some guidance on where they need to make those investments in the project lifecycle. Decisions are formally documented in a standard form in our deliverables. Decisions are recorded with at least 2 alternatives, which is kind of a call out back to the preceding step of the value chain, the analyze. And that we not only describe and document our architecture decisions, but we support them with rationale, namely a reason why we thought this alternative was better than the other alternative. Level 4, decisions may be even more rigorously managed, where they're managed in an enterprise repository, so as opposed to being just put into a table in a Word document. And of course, one of the challenges with that, which is again better than not making the decisions at all and telling anybody, is that, you know, what we see a lot of is, you know, organizations follow their solution delivery lifecycle, you know, populate their architectural deliverables and other deliverables to, you know, to create the solution. And then when the project's over, all of those deliverables are piled into the project deliverable dump truck, taken out to the project deliverable landfill, and buried with thousands of other artifacts, never to be seen from again. And if you're, you know, want to go back and say, if you're a new architect, for example, and are like, hey, is there a reason why the thing I'm working on is the way it is today? And someone might say, well, you know, here's a pitchfork and a shovel, and if you go out to the architecture landfill, you could go dig up some stuff, and boy, you might find some interesting things and maybe actually find what you're looking for. But obviously, again, that's not really exploiting that information to the enterprise's benefit. So being able to manage that stuff in an enterprise repository could be very effective. We actually trace our decisions to architecture principles, which is a way to make those principles much more real, because we can see evidence that those principles are influencing our decision making, and hopefully, as TOGAF describes, you know, are causing us to see the outcomes of those decisions as it relates to certain types of desirable behaviors. We actually trace our decisions to explicit architectural elements of which the decisions are pertinent to, and we actually tie those decisions to business outcomes. And then, implicitly tie them to outcomes. In level 5, they're explicitly tied to outcomes, and we actually monitor the efficacy of our decisions over time, because of course that's one of the big things that is important, is that, you know, just because you made a particular decision, you know, 2 or 3 years ago, does not mean that those are good decisions now. And then we can make an assessment based on these requirements. What is the current level of maturity, and what is our future's desired level of maturity? And then similarly, what other related capabilities are we going to probably have to make some investments in to uplift the architecture decision-making capability? So here we see, again, a similar diagram that we saw before that was really talking about the coverage, or how well does TOGAF 9 address these different parts of the value chain. Here's an example of an architectural maturity assessment based on the same capability model. So in this particular case, we're still not doing a really good job in requirements, analysis, reporting, and human capital management. We're doing okay with things like modeling and planning and lifecycle management. We have some standards in road mapping and governance, but certainly a huge opportunity for improvement. And again, the whole idea behind this is to use a conveyance like this when dealing with both executive management in IT and the business when you're trying to say, in the context of the initiatives you want to support, we feel we need to uplift and make investments in these different kind of capabilities. Here's kind of where we're at, and given the resources that we've got to throw at this, where do we think we want to apply those resources for the greatest benefit? And of course, ultimately, this gets into, like we talked a little bit earlier, about creating an architecture roadmap for the enterprise architecture practice. And this is something that is acknowledged in a little section in TOGAF, which I really think of it being, bootstrapping enterprise architecture with enterprise architecture. And that's really kind of the theme of this, is going, hey, if building value chains and capability models are good things for the business, why don't we do that in enterprise architecture? And when we do all that stuff with the business, we end up creating different types of models. We analyze those models, make decisions about those models, and then we put together a roadmap that talks about how we're going to improve that thing over time. Well, kind of maybe obvious, but perhaps not as much as it could be. Why don't we apply those practices internally to the enterprise architecture capability? So I think I kind of just summarized here kind of the conclusions that, it's been, my and I'm sure many of yours observations that value chains and capability models are emerging as best practices for, doing planning, making investments, and improving the capability of the organization. And if those things are good for the frontline business, we should really try to internalize those things when we're thinking about how to improve and uplift our architecture practice. And, particularly, this is something perhaps that might be another topic in the future around the architecture profession, is that, as the architecture profession continues to advance and mature, I believe it's really important for us to come to a common understanding of what are those things that no matter what kind of architect you are, at what level of abstraction you perform those activities, this is what makes you an architect. Because I do find it rather curious, and perhaps you guys have observed the same thing, that I'm unaware of any other profession, in IT at least, that tries to differentiate itself from all its peers to the extent architects do. So, we've got business architects and capability architects and domain architects and technology architects, service architects, application architects, technology architects, infrastructure architects, project architects, solution architects. And it's like, do we even have that many architects in our organization? And we just don't see, at least in my opinion, that same sort of differentiation in project management, business analysis, and developers. So I really think it's important for the preservation and the future of our profession that we really come to concurrence that even though we may have specializations, we actually share much more in common with one another that defines our profession than differentiates us. So, as a way to, extend our appreciation for participation in today's event and future events, we're offering to AEA members a 25% discount on our TOGAF web-based training. And if you're interested in kind of getting a look at what that might look like, you can go to the URL that you see here on our website, Free EA Training. And of course, if you have any additional questions about the content of this or ways that we can, help improve your end user experience with architecture, don't hesitate to contact us for more information. Some of the topics that we're considering for the remainder of the webinar series as that unfolds over the next into 2015 is, one of the things that we took a closer look at here, architecture decision making. I tend to see this being a really important part of what makes an architect an architect. And ironically, in TOGAF, it really doesn't say anything about it except you should do it. So there's certainly some more depth we could get to that. What are reference models and reference architectures? How are they related but different? A big thing that we think is important is how do we focus on, the second half of the value chain. So we created a bunch of models and understand and analyze, well, what are we doing with that? And, what kind of models do we need to put in place to actually make reuse happen, potentially aligning with open source approaches? Some emerging thoughts around continuous architecture and agile enterprise architecture. How does IT for IT, a new forum, that's at the architecture, at the open group that you may be aware of as it relates to, the business of IT. different kinds of EA tools and the requirements that we might have, particularly as it relates to the two class of tools that I think people need to have. EA content management tools and EA lifecycle management tools, the whole idea that there's a difference between architecture at rest versus architecture in motion. Certainly a operational concern that a lot of organization has is PCI compliance as it relates to credit cards and what does that have to do with enterprise architecture, as well as some more in-depth discussions around the TOGAF architecture repository. So thanks so much to Birgit and her team for inviting us to participate and providing this platform, and thanks so much everybody to taking an hour out of your Friday to spend some time with us. And look very much forward to the next one. I don't think, Birgit, we've explicitly scheduled that necessarily for next month. I'm hoping we will, but there's always the holidays that might make that challenging. So if we don't do one next month, which I hope we will, we certainly will do one again in January. So back to you, Birgit.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Great. So I just want to thank Chris for speaking. He's just, I think, one of the most engaging speakers that I've had the privilege of hearing the last several years. And it looks like we will be running these webinars probably the second Friday of each month. We will be setting up those dates with Chris, and then we'll be sending out those webinars. And thank you all. I do hope that you take advantage of that discount that Chris has offered so graciously. And we will be recording the session today and making that available to AEA members on the site, and we'll be sending out an email with that information as well. So thank you all. If you have any other questions, don't hesitate to send those, and do take another minute to answer the additional poll questions. Thank you very much.